Hello, and welcome to a review for a couple of Kings of War tournaments. Despite being a little bit busy last couple months, I did manage to sneak in not one, but two local tournament events in November. So in this video, I want to just go over those and not do all-out battle reports on each battle, but just briefly talk about each battle and how it went and my thoughts on it, and then review lots and lots of pictures that I took, and then give some overall impressions and thoughts on how the tournaments went, what I liked about them, what I didn't like about them, and kind of compare the two against each other, because although they were both smaller scale, local, kind of for fun tournaments, they had some pretty strong differences, and I'll talk about that at the end. So these are just some of the armies that were at the event. I was taking pictures before we got started, and a lot of great looking armies. So it was both events were a ton of fun, and looking forward to diving in. So the first event was Twinklefest, and that was supposed to be 6 games. We ended up only playing 5. I think people wanted to get home in time for the Seahawks game at the end. And I wasn't originally going to go to this event. I had already scheduled to go to a Food Hammer at the end of November, and I was okay with only having one event. But one of the organizers of the tournament contacted me, asked if I was going, and I said, well, I don't quite have 2,000 points painted, and it's a 2,000 point tournament. And even if it's allowed, I don't play with unpainted miniatures. I just think the game's at its best when it's all painted. To which he responded I could borrow some of his, which I didn't expect, but that was really generous of him. So my force did have 500 points of very dark elf looking high elves. And in retrospect, I should have just used some of my lizardmen allies. I've got about 1,000 points of painted lizardmen, and they look great, and they have a similar color and painting scheme as the high elves. I intentionally made them kind of have a similar feel back when they were the Warhammer armies, and that would have been, I think, way better. It was really cool of the organizer to let me use some of his models, but it didn't quite look right to me. I did kind of clash, and I, after the fact, thought, why the hell didn't I just use Lizardman allies? But anyway, enough about that. Let's take a look at the force that I brought real quick. So running through the list really quickly here, we have a Horde of Spear with the Brew of Strength, a Horde of Archers with the Heart Piercing Chant, gives them Piercing 1, 3 Bolt Throwers, a Mage with the Extra Spell magic item, Army Battle Standard Bearer with the Healing Charm, a Regiment of Palace Guard, Regiment of Tall Spears, Troop of Stormwind Cavalry, a Regiment of Chariots, a Lord or a Drakon Rider Lord, another Mage with Inspiring Talisman. Both the mages, by the way, have the Fireball and Bane Chant upgrades. And then finally a troop of Gladestalkers. So on to the first battle. Now, unfortunately, both of these events off to kind of a rough start. I think this first game that I played was my least favorite out of all of them, which was a real shame to kind of start off on a bad note. There's several reasons for this. I was initially really excited because this is a great looking army. I hadn't played the Brotherhood. It's been forever since I'd even played Britannia back in Warhammer, so I was kind of looking forward to this. But it was a kill scenario, and I did terribly. I didn't really know how to fight this army, and I was a bit rusty. So that was one reason it wasn't as fun, because I really got destroyed. But that's not the main thing, I think, because I can get destroyed in games and have a lot of fun. It's happened a couple times recently, actually. Most recently, I think that Twilight King player just schmopped me, but I really enjoyed that game because it really taught me important lessons, and both armies looked so good that it was still just really fun to watch. But there were a couple things that were frustrating about this game. One, the deployment, the terrain, I thought wasn't very well set up. This was the only time that I strongly had this complaint out of both events, because if you look at this picture here, one side has several forests and then a hill that's kind of back towards the back end of the table, and then the other side has just a hill that's kind of awkwardly more towards the middle. So one side is way better, in my opinion, than the other. Because if you get the side with the forest, you can start in cover, and then the hill on that side is also further back, so you can plant your shooty, more defensive units further back where they're safe and put other units in front. And this game, my opponent won the role for choosing table side, which, oh well, that happens, and it's frustrating when it's so lopsided. And then he also won the role for going first. And I think this is the only time that I played Kings of War where I felt like that rule maybe doesn't work. Where if you choose table side, maybe you should automatically go second, or some system like that, because that felt like a real disadvantage. Now, if I really knew what I was doing and came at this with a better plan to begin with, I don't think it would have mattered. But then this game also there was a couple, it's the first time I've had a real rules dispute in a Kings of War game, and that flared up once or twice, and that's kind of a bummer. That happened a lot in Warhammer, and Kings of War, I think, is a better, more elegant rule system that lends itself better to not having to look things up all the time. It's kind of more logical, fits together better. But it did happen, and that's a bad sign when the game gets bogged down in that. And I was right, but we did go my way. Although I said we could just do it either way because I didn't want to spend too much time on it. But a rough start, and I got utterly destroyed, kill scenario. So, dang. Fortunately, I did get a chance to rematch this opponent at the next event. He was actually at the next event also, and that game was pretty fantastic and was really fun. So he was a good opponent. I know that we can have a good game. I think the stars just didn't align for this one, which was a bummer. So the second game at Twinklefest was Invade Scenario. I played against a newer player to Kings of War, someone that hadn't played Warhammer previously, which I think maybe the first time that's happened, that I played someone that wasn't a previous Warhammer player. And it was a dwarf army with elf allies, and it wasn't a demo game, so I didn't go easy, and I won this one really solidly. Didn't take as many pictures, primarily because his army wasn't painted, so I wanted to focus on the really good-looking armies. But it was a really fun game. He had a great attitude. He ended up winning an award for Best Newcomer, or something like that. So that was cool because he didn't do super well in the tournament, but it looked like he had a lot of fun and he was fun to play against. So that's kind of the important thing there, I think. So my third game at Twinklefest was the Dominate scenario, where you have to have units totally within 12 inches of the center point of the board. And I played against a herd player. I had a really cool looking herd army. And this was a really fun game, although my opponent was getting pretty frustrated about halfway through. He was starting to get really angry, and that gets a little awkward, but he regained his composure by the end of it. And I can kind of understand why he got so angry, because he was off to a phenomenal start. He's the herd, so he's playing very aggressively. And I went first, and he was almost every unit was totally within cover in the woods somewhere. This was kind of another board where the woods were lopsided. But fortunately, I went first, so it wasn't as big of a deal. But I focused everything I had on one of the flying units that was in range to hit one of my war machines or archers, and wavered that. And then on his first turn, he moved up, and then on his next turn, he was able to destroy 3, maybe even 4 of my units. I mean, hit me hard. I think it was 3 units. And then I think he must have been thinking at that point, this is in the bag. And so what happened next, I understand, may have been frustrating, because I moved forward with some the Palace Guard and then some cavalry, and every turn that horde of archers with the Bane Chant combo, it's a little cheesy, but it works, was killing about a unit. Every turn it was killing a unit, sometimes a monstrous general and sometimes longhorns. And so it took him like 3 turns to break through the Palace Guard and the cavalry. And he never at the end got to the archers or the boltors. Those were both still alive at the end of the game. So it was frustrating, I think, to think that you're off to such a great start and then just to have your army destroyed unit by unit, turn by turn, when you're so close. It actually ended up being a tie, as we each got a couple units into the within the center point of the board by the end, but neither of us had more than the 200 points difference needed to secure a victory. Now, this tournament also graded on how much you killed your opponent on top of whether or not you won. So you had a base score based on who won or if you tied, and then you adjusted that score based on how badly you killed your opponent. So I think there's 20 points possible, and when you tie, it's 10-10, and then based on the difference, I think this ended up being 12-8 my favor. So close game. It was fun. I look forward to playing this guy again. He came up from Oregon, so out of town, but I look forward to the rematch and enjoyed the game. So game 4 of Twinklefest was the loot scenario. I believe it was loot. I sometimes mix up loot and pillage. This was the one where you had to control the objective markers, and there was several throughout the board that you take turns placing. You can't move them. So I'm pretty sure that's loot. I was up against another elf player, which was nice because I totally knew what his army could do and how it worked. There's not as much... It's not like Warhammer with 100 special rules per army, and God knows what's happening if you don't know their army book. But I have found that the armies are still, even though they're not complicated and awkwardly convoluted, they play different. They have different play styles, and there's different ways to combat different armies. And I've found when I'm playing armies I've never played before, I tend to lose pretty bad. So I was looking forward to a real fair fight in the sense that we both knew each other's armies and kind of the playstyle possibilities of those armies well. I think this was my favorite game of this event. I'd say definitely favorite game of the event. I was really getting the hang of it at this point and getting a feel for the objectives, the scenarios, which I hadn't played a whole bunch of for on my own, and went into this game with a plan. And you can see that from the deployment. The regiment of tall spears right behind the horde of tall spears, angled as if they've got a purpose, because they're not just pointing straight forward. And then I was setting up kind of battle groups that were centered around a unit with inspiring. And based on where the loot markers were, I had a plan to kind of feint for the right with fast units that weren't worth a lot of points to draw his attention over there, and knowing that I was going to give up those loot markers and get a strong control on the center and the left side. The left side with the archers in the cover of the woods, and then some, I think, Drakon Rider support, and then the horde of spear taking the hill in the middle, supported by the Palace Guard on one side, and then the regiment of spear on the other. So the plan was send the Gladestalkers and the chariots out as kind of sacrificial, like move up, shoot, kind of dance around as long as possible and survive, and look threatening, but know that they're just going to get killed, while the archers just kill as much as they can each turn, and the heavy infantry secures the middle. And it worked really well. It worked a lot better than I planned because my opponent made a really critical mistake. One of his mages had Bane Chant, and it was past the shooting phase on his turn. It was like towards the end of his turn, I forgot to Bane Chant my heavy pike. Was this a King? No, it was an elf army. I think he had some Kings of Men allies. That's what it was. But he forgot to Bane Chant his heavy pike, and he wanted to. And so I said, okay, sure, go ahead. Being a good sport. Sure glad I did, because, wow, he actually Bane Chanted he was next to the heavy pike. He wanted to Bane Chant my horde of spear that was across his heavy pike. And so I let him, and he rolled really high on it, and he actually pushed my horde of spear far enough to the right that I went from being in the front arc of his pike block to the flank. And this was like the last thing he did on his turn. So I didn't even notice until he pointed it out. So that's a tidbit if you're playing. If you see some big opening you've made or some vulnerability, don't advertise it. You're still a good sport even if you don't advertise your weaknesses, because your opponent may not see it. And I don't think I saw that initially. He pointed it out, and I thought, oh my god, that's his most expensive unit, and I've got it. And I did. The 30 attacks with that horde of spear hit him in the flank, so that was double, and I think I managed to Bane Chant him, so they were gone. Even with the inspiring, that horde of pike were out of it. And then the rest of the game was kind of cleanup. But he didn't give up, and I think I gave this guy the sportsmanship award as the top sport because despite how demoralizing that must have been, he really kept in it, and we played a pretty good game with some good back and forth even after that point. And the final game at Twinklefest, not my favorite game there, probably because it was a little too easy for I think three main reasons. One being it was against forces of nature, which I'm very familiar with playing. Second thing, I was really getting the hang of the scenarios and how to use this 2,000 point list at this point. I think I was getting better at a faster rate than a lot of the people around me because I started off struggling a bit more, and by the end of the tournament, I was in a real good groove. But then the last point too is my opponent was I think an 11 or 12-year-old, and it's good to introduce younger people to the hobby and get them involved. And I like seeing new people, but he was not the most competitive and didn't have the best attention span, which is understandable for a younger guy. So it was pretty easy game, and I was, as you can see from the picture here, I was learning some pretty good tricks, keeping my bolt throwers just a bit in the forest so they could see through it without cover, keeping my archers further back, which should be obvious but wasn't to me initially, and then also kind of approaching the whole thing with the plan. So it was fun to have a plan and execute it and have it work really well, but just not the most challenging. But that was Twinklefest. It was a great event overall. It was over 2 days, ended up being 5 games. I placed third as far as general points, like how well you did in the battles. And then I think I got 4th overall when you factor in painting score and sportsmanship score. And it was nice to be graded on painting, even though I got reduced points for borrowing someone's models and it not being coordinated. I normally just play casual play, and I really enjoyed having someone look at my army and critique it and judge whether or not it was coordinated color scheme and if I had done any conversions and things like that. So that was pretty cool. And I'll save the rest of the final thoughts for when I kind of compare the two events. So let's start taking a look at Food Hammer. Food Hammer. 1-day event, 4 games, all for charity. This was a pretty fantastic event. My first game was against a Ratkin player, which was a ton of fun because I have not had a chance to really play Ratkin at all. And they're a zany list. They're an interesting mix of hordes, cheap infantry blocks, but also lots of zany shooting attacks. So both of us had... my list is pretty shooting heavy, but it's capable in combat also, so it's not as balanced as it should be, I think, but it's got a lot of flexible shooting units like the chariots and the pathfinders. And I found his list was kind of similar. It had a lot of units that could charge in or could shoot, like the death engine, things like that. So really fun game. I started focusing everything I had on the rat monster because it just looked scary, so kill it. And then it was pretty close. It was, I believe it was kill scenario. So that's, I'm not sure. I think it was kill scenario. But yeah, it worked well. It was really down to the wire and a lot of back and forth. He really captured the right side. Chariots are terrible. They let me down just about every single game, and I'm not giving up on them. I'm gonna paint up 2 more, make it into a horde, and give it the nimble special rule. But a regiment of chariots, I think in any army, I can't justify the points. They need to reduce the points, make them better or something. But I ended up winning this game, not by a lot, but it was a really fun, close game and a good chance to play Ratkin. And my second game at Food Hammer was, I think, the most fun game I had out of both events, out of all 9 games. And I think by a decent margin, too. My opponent's army was all werewolves. It was a herd army, so it wasn't undead. There were herd werewolves, which are slightly different. The characters are a little different, I think. And it was just a couple of regiments, a couple of hordes, and a couple of the alphas. And I think what made the game so fun, one was his army was really unique. Now, most armies, mine like them have a little bit of cavalry, a little bit of shooting, a war machine, just kind of a little bit of everything, and it's got just a different flavor. If it's elf, it's elfy. If it's dwarf, it's dwarfy. Like that. This was totally different. They were all werewolves, which meant they were all really fast and maneuverable. They all have nimble. And they have okay defense, but not great defense, but they regenerate. And they hit really hard. So his whole army had a really strong character and really definite strengths, but then also some really definite weaknesses in that he was outnumbered and he didn't have super great defense. So that made it kind of a fun challenge to face something that was really different and see if I can overcome his strengths and exploit his weaknesses. He also had a really great attitude. He's a fun person to play. He recognized my army from my videos, so that was kind of a fun way to start the battle off. It was a very, very close game, and my horde of archers with the Bane Chant combo is just it's a Death Star. You just point it at what you want dead, and it becomes dead. And what I also really liked about this game is it really exaggerated the point and the importance of the scenarios, because I ended up losing this game even though I only lost about 3 units and wiped out almost everything he had. I think he had a single character left, or a character and 1 regiment of the werewolf guys. But that didn't matter because there were 3 objectives. You have to capture them. By the end of the game, he had 1 of them. I had none, and I could have tied if we went to a 7th turn, but we didn't. And his flexibility won him the game. And I love that about this game with the scenarios. Is it's not about creating the best combo at killing things. It's not about sitting on the back edge of the board and just out shooting your opponent. I know that it was hard with Warhammer to get those more dynamic games because it really just became more about getting those kills and denying points by having units that were hard to kill yourself. So throughout these events, especially at Foodhammer, I was out killing my opponent, but then not necessarily winning, either tying or losing based on the scenario. So that was pretty great. Really fun game, and I really look forward to playing this guy again. I hope he gets these werewolves painted up because it was a super fun game, even without them painted. So if you're listening, paint those werewolves, come on down to the US, and let's do a rematch. So my 3rd game at Foodhammer was against the same Brotherhood player that I had played a few weeks earlier at Twinklefest. Now, I didn't get any pictures of this. I was pretty focused on the game because I wanted to do better this time because I knew I just didn't do as well as I could have the first game. And I did really well, and I really liked this game. It was really fun, and I think we both came out of it feeling like we'd done really well. He won because he secured the objectives. It was loot. But I'd killed about half of his army and lost just a unit or 2 myself. So I think in my mind, I was like rematching that kill scenario from a few weeks earlier and kind of felt like I won. I was like, yeah, I killed all his stuff. That wasn't the point, though. And again, that really reinforced what I was saying about the last battle, where the objectives really matter, and it doesn't matter how much you can kill if you don't have a flexible force that can get out there and capture objectives. So I was really glad to have that kind of redo and replace that not as good game with a much better one and have a lot of fun. So, great game. And my final game at Foodhammer and for these 2 events was against a Kingdoms of Men player. And I was really happy to get this matchup as the final game because I saw this army at Twinklefest but didn't get the chance to play it there. And there was a couple armies that just looked really cool and I really wanted the chance to play. And I was really happy to get this set up as the final game at Foodhammer so I could play it. And it was a really fun game. I think this was the best matchup I've had as far as what my army's good against. Because his army was very good at countering charges. He had a lot of maneuverable troops, some good artillery, and then a lot of pikemen. And pikemen are great, but not against my army. I've got a very flexible force that if I don't like the combat, I don't have to engage. And he had a lot of defense 3, defense 4 guys that Archer Horde and the Boltors just destroyed. I got the roll for first turn, and I destroyed 2 of his units before he even got to go. So it was really fun, and there were some really fun highlights. Like he charged in and destroyed my chariots with his mounted sergeants. Chariots, such garbage. But then my army battle standard bearer held out for 2 or 3 turns, did better than the chariots, while the bolt thrower was back there shooting at those sergeants, and eventually I was able to kill them off. So both of these events were a lot of fun, and I'm really glad that I'm engaging these tournaments and these events and traveling around and finding different people and armies and clubs to play, because I didn't do that enough when I was active in Warhammer, and I really regretted it. Between the two, I think I had a lot of fun at both, but I had more fun at Foodhammer. Part of that, there was a bar in the gaming area, and a lot of people were having a lot of beers, and there was a real sense of merriment. And I think the way that the scoring worked it was interesting how Twinklefest did it, where you had a base score based on winning or losing, and then you would adjust points based on how much you killed. That sounded interesting, but I think it led to over-competitiveness for this kind of more casual setup tournament. Whereas with Foodhammer, the focus was just on the objectives, and I like that more because I think it's more fun when it's just about the objectives, and you don't have like when that werewolf character beat me, even though I'd killed almost everything. In Twinklefest, that would have been probably like a 12-8 or something really even, whereas at Foodhammer, he just won, and I kind of like it better that way. It also keeps people from, like when I was playing that elf player at Twinklefest, I wanted to kind of hurry through the game and get as many points as possible, because if we just called it and stopped at turn 3, or if he took a long turns and we didn't get through the whole game, I'd be losing points compared to people that played all the way through. So I think that system created a slightly more competitive vibe than the Foodhammer approach, which was just win or lose. So both great events, and great job both organizers of the events. I'm definitely planning on doing both again next year. And if you're curious how the results turned out for Foodhammer, the werewolf player actually won the best general, the best score, or the win ratio. And my brother ended up winning best overall when you factor in sportsmanship, painted, and general scores. And then I ended up getting favorite opponent. So I got the sportsmanship award, which was pretty great and felt really good. And just a great event overall. So there you have it. 2 fantastic events in 1 month. I'm looking forward to doing more in the near future, and I'm looking forward to getting several more videos out over the next couple weeks. I've got a couple weeks off, so it's going to be a great opportunity to crank out more videos. So thanks for watching. See you next time.